In the last video we took everything apart. Now we're ready to start refurbishing it all and putting it back together again. The first thing we'll do is refurbish the glove box doors. The easiest way to do that is just to repaint them. So firstly we'll carefully remove all the trim and then we'll give them a good rub down with wet and dry paper to remove any uneven areas and make sure there's no corrosion. Then we'll give them a good wash to make sure there isn't any sand or any other particles remaining, and we'll dry them very thoroughly. They need to be completely dry and clean before we start painting them. As there's not very much to be painted here, we'll just use a rattle can of cellulose almond green paint. We'll give them a number of thin coats. Many thin coats is much better than one coat that's too heavy and runs. To clean the paint nozzle when we've finished, we just hold the can upside down and give it a blast until paint stops coming out. Now the next thing to do is the dashboard. We give that the same treatment as we did the glove box doors. We give it a good rub down with wet and dry paper and make sure it is completely clean and dry. Then we'll mask it up very carefully. The masking needs to cover almost the entire interior of the car. It's surprising how far spray paint will travel. And again, we'll give it a number of thin coats rather than one very thick one. The next part for refurbishment is the indicator switch. This is in terrible condition, and as you can still buy these, it's much easier just to replace it. First, we'll feed the wires from the new switch through the bottom of the steering column clamp, following the same route as the old ones. Then we'll mount the switch onto the steering column. The best position can vary from car to car, but to start with, push it on as far as it can go until it's right up against the switch cover mounting bracket. Horizontally, it should be lined up with the left-hand screw hole on the switch cover mounting bracket. Now we need to check that everything's in the right position. The copper shoe on the indicator switch should be riding on the brass ring on the steering column. On the steering column there's a domed screw that acts as a self-cancellation for the indicators. That should be lined up with the spike on the switch. If everything's not quite in the right place, you may need to slide the steering column in and out slightly in the steering column clamp. Once everything's perfectly lined up, don't forget to tighten up the steering column clamp. Now we'll feed the wires up through the hole into the dashboard. It's easier if the ends are wrapped first in a little bit of masking tape. Now we reap the benefits of cutting off the old wire and leaving the end in place. The colours are exactly the same on the new wire, so all we need to do is match the colours. And here I'm pulling a bullet connector out with a pair of pliers by pulling on the wire. That's not a good idea because it can damage it. In this case we're going to throw it away, so it doesn't really matter. I'll cover the proper way to do it in a later video. Now we take the new wire with the matching colour and we push it into place. Here I'm using a pair of needle nose pliers, but there is a proper tool to use. Again, I'll cover that in a later video. We repeat the exercise matching the other coloured wires, and there it is, it's done. The anodised aluminium trim surrounding the speedometer is one of the hardest parts on the Morris Minor to refurbish. There's no new old stock available and nobody seems to be making any reproductions at the moment. You do occasionally find them on eBay, but they tend to be very expensive and may not be in any better condition than the one you've got at the moment. If we look at the edge of the sheet where the chrome trim piece has protected it, we can see that it was originally very shiny. It might be possible to have it reanodized commercially, but that's likely to be very expensive and it's not clear if the results would be any good. We may look at that in a future video. For now, the best shot is probably to find the best one we can and then paint it. I've tried a number of different materials and Genolite chrome paint seems to give the best result. Unlike other paints, you can't really build this up in thin layers. I found that to get a good result, you've really got to get a good solid layer on in one go. Otherwise, you don't really get the chrome effect. Don't get too much on though, otherwise it puddles and looks terrible. It's actually a bit tricky, so it's best to practice on a scrap piece if you have one. Once the paint's thoroughly dry and hardened, we can refit the aluminium panel to the dashboard and refit the switches. For the moment, don't tighten them up too far because we might need to slide the panel around a little bit. Next, we'll reattach the wires to the speedometer. About now, you're probably wishing you'd taken a photograph. To make it easier, we'll separate the wires into two bundles, one with the bulbs attached and the others with plain connectors. The black and green wire comes from the sender in the fuel tank and goes to the tab on the fuel gauge. The lamp with the single blue and white wire is the main beam warning light. The lamp with two wires, one of them brown and yellow and the other white, is the ignition warning light. The lamp with two wires, one green and the other green and brown, is the oil pressure warning light. The lamp with two wires, one green and the other green and yellow, is the oil filter warning light. The two lamps, each with a single red and white wire, are the panel lights. The remaining wires, which are all green, connect to tab B on the voltage regulator. Now we can carefully put the speedometer back into the dash, taking care not to scratch the newly painted aluminium panel with the side mounting screws. We'll tighten the mounting screw on one side temporarily, just to make a good earth so we can test the electrics. We'll reattach the battery, earth last of course, so that we can test everything before we go very much further. These quick tests are just a precaution. We don't want to bolt everything back together again and then find we've got to pull it all apart because of an electrical issue. Anyway, everything seems to be okay, so now we'll disconnect the battery again. Earth first, of course, and get on with assembling everything. Now we can remove our temporary earth from the speedometer, ease the speedometer out, and we'll reattach the speedometer cable. Now we can pop the speedometer back in again and tighten up both of the mounting screws. It's virtually impossible to find chrome trim pieces in good condition, so the easiest way to deal with this is to have them re-chromed. Before you send them off to the chromer, you'll need to remove the threaded rods in the back. Whatever you do, don't try and do this with pliers. The best way to do it is to put two nuts onto the rods, then tighten one up against the other and take them out that way. You can use the same technique for putting them back in again if they're tight. The chrome trim pieces are not made of very high quality metal. If your chromer's any good, they'll probably write to you warning you that they might not be able to achieve perfect results. I decided to go ahead anyway, and I'm very pleased with the results. There are a few imperfections, but they're all in areas that are hidden by the glove box door, so generally they look pretty good. Once you're finished, wipe them down so that the acid from your fingerprints won't do any damage. It's also a good idea to keep a rolled up newspaper handy. If anybody touches them, hit them with a newspaper. Now we can refit the choke cable. If the end of it is frayed at all, then just melt some solder into it, snip it off and file it down flat. This is also a good time to give it a little bit of lubrication. It can be hard to find the hole in the bulkhead for the choke cable from under the dashboard, so it's a good idea to run a little piece of light coloured wire through as a guide. Inside the dashboard, try and follow the straightest path with no curves. Now we thread the choke cable back through the dashboard. Don't forget to fit the lock washer and nut. We pass it through the dashboard following the line of the guide cable we put in earlier, and then we'll tighten up the nut and the lock washer on the back. We'll reattach the choke cable to the carb. First the outer sleeve, which just clicks into place, and then the inner wire, leaving just a little bit of slack on it. And we'll give it a quick test. It's working okay. So now we can replace the air filter. The choke should slide in and out quite freely, but if you give it a twist to the right, it should lock. Then twist to the left again, and that frees it off. A properly set up choke cable should pull itself back into the dashboard when it's not in the locked position. Unfortunately, some chokes won't stay out because a prior owner forced it in the locked position and broke the lock. You sometimes see Morris Minors with a clothes peg on the choke cable to keep it out. Of course, if it's a traveller, you should use a wooden clothes peg and it should be matched to your wood. It is possible to refurbish glove box liners, but it's much easier just to get a new one. To make room, we'll temporarily remove the indicator switch again and just let it hang down on the wires for a few minutes. Carefully insert the glove box liner. Make sure your hands are very clean because they really pick up dirt very, very easily. Screwing it into place is just the opposite of removing it. 4 screws, top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right. Next, we'll fit the glove box cover. That's held in place with 3 screws. I hope you kept them safely. 1 in the top in the middle and 2 on the bottom, 1 on each side. The ones on the bottom have cup washers. After that's in place, we can return the trim. Now we can return the indicator switch, not forgetting to check that everything's still in alignment. Indicator switch covers are still easily available, so the best route here is just to buy a new one. It goes on the same way it came off, and there are 3 screws, 1 on the top, 1 in the bottom, and 1 on the left-hand side. And here's the missing switch for the windscreen washer pump inside the dashboard. I can see why it wasn't fitted. It's too big to go in the hole in the dashboard. Instead, I put in a temporary switch, but unfortunately it doesn't look very nice. I prefer something that looked a bit more like the original plunger. The left-hand glove box liner was missing. I haven't got a new one, but I found an old one to put in there temporarily. It's hidden behind the glove box door, so it's not such a big deal. It goes in with 4 screws, same as the one on the right-hand side. I've used washers here because the holes in this one are a little bit raggy. And we'll return the glove box door. 4 screws, 2 bottom left, 2 bottom right. And now the horn button. This is held together by 3 metal tabs. We can prise these open very carefully with a screwdriver while holding it all together. Then release it gently and it'll probably fly into pieces and all the bits will end up on the floor. And here are all the pieces. Somebody on the internet said you could hide the cracks in a horn button by soaking it overnight in olive oil. So I've given that a try. I honestly can't say that I can see very much difference, except the garage smells like a Greek salad. You can find used horn buttons on eBay, of course, but they tend to be in poor condition. Some of the regular suppliers have new old stock or reproduction buttons from time to time, but this is a rare part and they tend to be expensive. I'm very lucky as I've had an original spare in my garage for many years. Reassembly is a bit tricky as you have to hold everything in place against the spring while you bend down the tabs. Try not to bend them more often than necessary as they will eventually snap off. Now we can replace the steering wheel. First make sure the road wheels are straight and then slide it back onto the splines, preferably with a bit of grease. On the 2-spoke wheel, the spokes normally go to the top to represent the old 10-to-2 driving position, but there's no reason you can't have them pointing down if you prefer to grip the wheel that way. According to the workshop manual, there should be a lock washer under the steering wheel retaining knot. I've never seen one, but I've got one, so I'll fit it. Tighten down the nut firmly, but don't go crazy. Just make sure the wheel is fully home. Now we can press in the horn fitting and we're pretty much finished. The steering wheel still needs a bit of work, but that's another video for another time. The top of the dash and the glove box doors need a bit of rubbing compound and polish, but this is cellulose paint, so I'm going to leave that for a while to be sure it's good and hard. All in all, it's not a bad weekend's work, and I'm quite pleased with the improvements. And just one more comment before I go. I don't think I've ever seen an aluminium trim panel that didn't have scratches on it. These scratches come from keys on key rings. If you put your main key on a piece of string, you can avoid any damage to your trim panel and to your door locks. Thanks for watching. See you next time.